Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Esha Sheth. I'm a second-year law student and cyber scholar here at NYU, and I'm excited to kick off our first panel on synthetic media challenges and solutions. For a long time, we've relied on relatively straightforward signals to make important decisions: what we see, what we hear, and who we think we're interacting with. Those assumptions are no longer stable in the age of deepfakes. Synthetic media is creating a set of challenges that are evolving incredibly quickly, both in how realistic content can be and in how easily and inexpensively it can be created and distributed at scale. As we move into an environment where seeing or hearing something is no longer enough to treat it as reliable, the question isn't just what's real or not. It's how we design systems that allow people, institutions, and markets to operate with confidence across a range of sectors. In law school, we often begin with policy and regulation as a starting point. But in this space, there are real questions about how far regulation can and should go, whether that's how quickly it can adapt, how flexible it can be, or how it interacts with the broader landscape that includes overlapping state, federal, and international approaches. At the same time, a range of other responses are being explored. Some focus on detection and others on prevention or mitigation. Some look to authentication or provenance as ways to establish stronger signals of trust, while others rely more on standards, best practices, or market-driven incentives. Rather than a single all-encompassing solution, responses to the issue seem to be emerging across a range of approaches developing in parallel. This panel brings together perspectives from across those interdisciplinary spaces to think through the challenges of synthetic media and how different solutions might fit together. So we're incredibly fortunate to have a group here that's working directly on these issues. Andersen is the CEO and co-founder of KIBU, where he's building a network that leverages trust between small groups to establish a baseline of human trust in digital interactions. Mounir Ibrahim is Chief Communications Officer at TRUEPIC, where he works on image and data authenticity across sectors including financial services, government, and media. Parsons is Senior Director of Content Authenticity at ADOBE, where he leads global efforts around content provenance as well as industry standards. And our moderator, Choi, is a partner at Arnold & Porter and former Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the National Security Division in the Department of Justice, and she brings a wealth of experience at the intersection of cybersecurity, national security, and emerging technologies. So with that, I'll hand it over to Anyang to get us started.
Great, and thanks for getting my name right. That's pretty impressive. I'm going to start with the most important thing for the lawyers in the room, other than the substance, obviously, which is the CLE warning. This panel has been approved to offer one New York State CLE credit in the category of cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection general. As a reminder, anyone seeking CLE credit must sign in and out of the CLE attendance sheet at the registration table, noting both their time of arrival and their time of departure. We cannot issue credit to attendees who do not provide their signature upon arrival and again upon departure. Very important, so please go out there if you haven't done so already. That was a lovely overview of your titles presently, but I thought maybe we could start off with each of you introducing yourselves from the perspective of how you came to the issue of deepfakes and synthetic media and the perspective that you bring to the challenges that are posed by that technology. So I guess we'll go in order from my right to left. Ari, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you, NYU and Judy and the Center for hosting us. Much less impressive than these gentlemen. I came to this issue simply out of passion and sort of naivete, to be honest. I was producing a documentary like 7 years ago on the harvesting of human behavioral data, and one of the people that I was talking to was a woman named Judy Estrin, who was one of the inventors of TCP/IP and then the first woman on the board of Disney. We're kind of talking about the next phase of the relationship between technology and human beings, and how that relationship, the power dynamic between big tech and everyday people was becoming more and more asymmetric. And I asked her, is there anything you think we can do to fight back? And she said, scale down for trust, interconnect for power. And it was just a sentence that embedded itself very deeply into my brain. And a couple of months later, find myself doing a two-factor password recovery. And at the same time, I was in a group chat with my best friends from childhood, and I just kind of had this thought of like, I trust these guys more than I trust my phone number not to get SIM swapped. Like, I wish I could use that for something. And ended up 6 years later here we basically have built an encryption protocol in a company that that leverages trust between small groups of people and biometrics on an endpoint to create a passwordless security layer and an encrypted comms channel.
Great, Andy?
That's pretty impressive for what it's worth.
Thanks, man.
We're going to try to give you a full CELA credit. I don't even know what we have to do. I think this panel should be worth 2 credits.
Just
Cool.
do what you're going to do.
Okay. So I'm Andy Parsons. I run the Content Authenticity Initiative at Adobe, which is a little over 5 years old. My interest in the subject area comes from a very different place than Ari's and some others here. I heard the last panel talk about copyright. So after studying engineering as an undergrad 100 years ago, I studied music, got my master's here in New York at the Manhattan School of Music, and endeavored to be a professional musician for some period of time. And I had copyright ripped off in a number of cases. I had made some records, put them out on CDs. Anybody remember what that is? I made those for a little while. And then I got the bug for technology startups and kind of mixed both for a while. But I always had this sort of niggling fear that copyright protections in the days of LimeWire, then Spotify and others would be sort of a luxury that future generations wouldn't benefit from. I wasn't even sure I was benefiting from it as a sort of dabbler of a musician. And then I've always been interested in Adobe creators. All my sort of startups along the way have been in the area of empowering creators with technology. And I suppose, if I've been prescient at all, it's recognizing that the better the tools, the worse it may be for rights holders and ultimately trust and truth. I think that's what we all have in common on this panel. So in 2019, when Scott Belsky, then head of Creative Cloud and Strategy at Adobe, made an announcement with the New York Times and Twitter about the Content Authenticity Initiative, Scott was an investor in one of my companies. I went to Scott and said, hey, what is this exactly? Like, I can't think of a better place to do this than Adobe, a company that doesn't have one foot in the ad industry, doesn't produce content, but rather produces tools and people buy those tools on their merit. And what a perfect place to insert some kind of authenticity where content is made, whether it's a menu or a feature film. And he said, well, there is no team, but you could come over here and start that team. And I was like, awesome, that's like right up my alley. So we did that in 2020, in the middle of COVID. And the initial idea, I think Ari and I were speaking backstage, we have a lot in common in terms of like cryptography and trust, because ultimately when outcomes are not deterministic and machines and their behavior are not deterministic, all you can really depend on in terms of trust and ownership and attribution of content is some sort of cryptographic secret that says, only Andy can be Andy, only the BBC can be the BBC, and only Paramount or what have you can be those companies. So Adobe has been steadfast in its support of this idea. We've built a standards body. I sit on the steering committee of that body. Maybe you'll talk a little bit more about the C2PA with Mounir and many others. And it's been a privilege. Last thing I'll say, which we'll talk about more, is this AI sort of fear and the consequences of deepfakes have been a catalyst for adopting the thing that we conceived in 2019. So that's what brought me here today. Thank you.
Thank you. And just echoing, thank you, Judy. Thank you, KIBU and NYU for having us here and holding this conversation. So, I think it's great to hear the backgrounds because it just shows how expansive this issue of identifying authentic from synthetic or authentic from manipulated content is and how many different areas it really hits. My background is very different. I've been with TRUEPIC. We develop technology that authenticates images, videos, data for about 8 years. But prior to that, I was actually a U.S. diplomat with the State Department. I was a foreign service officer. I was deployed around the world. And in 2010, I was in Damascus, Syria. And I was the political reporting officer at the U.S. Embassy in Damascus, reporting on human rights, civil society, religious freedom, at the start of the Arab Spring. I was the guy who went to the protests, saw people killed in front of me, saw extreme violence, ran from that violence, reported that back to Washington. Continued to work on the issue even after we suspended operations, closed down our embassy, and worked on it around the world. If you fast forward towards the end of my State Department career, I was the advisor to 2 different perm reps here in New York at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. And there we would see the entrance of video and image evidence from the ground in Syria, evidence of chemical weapons use, war crimes, attacks on schools, attacks on hospitals, and horrific things that you, I'm sure, have all read about. What we would also see is in the Security Council chamber time and time again, despite us having intelligence, the P5 and major countries having intelligence, knowing it was actually true, something called the liar's dividend, which Judy pointed out earlier. Bad actors, countries that wanted to deny reality or had ulterior motives would simply stand up and say, those images are fake. Those images came from a different conflict zone. Those images have manipulated time, dates, locations. This was in 2014, 15, 16, before AI, before this concept of a deepfake really went mainstream. And it was a highly effective strategy. And it was at that point I naively said, there's got to be a way to prove a digital image is, in fact, authentic. We'll talk about that more. Spoiler alert, there isn't, unless you're using some cryptographic proof at the moment of capture. That is how I found this company that I am now with, who came at it from a very different angle. They were thinking of insurance claims and online dating marketplaces and P2P marketplaces where people were being defrauded by, again, non-AI imagery, something we call cheap fakes. That's how I entered into this world, and that's why I think all three of us have this very interest in identifying authenticity from manipulation and synthesis.
I was thinking that I was going to be the doom and gloom of this session in terms of the implications because of my background, but Mounir might have beaten me to the punch. Just to give a little bit of my own background, just to sort of round the table out, I spent the majority of my career in the Department of Justice, starting as an AUSA here in the Southern District of New York, where I focused on cyber crimes. The first cybercrime case I had was a sextortion case involving a male child who had gone onto an internet platform, thought that he was talking to a female of his own age, engaged in intimate discussions and I would say tit for tat in terms of undressing and the like. You can fill in the blanks there. Created, what he thought was a relationship with a person online, where it turns out that person was in fact an adult male in Australia who threatened this child and said, hey, this is the video that I took of what you've done. And if you don't make 5 other videos or 10 other videos with these specifications, I'll send this video to all of your friends and family online. And you shouldn't come looking for me because I've hidden my location on Tor. And you shouldn't come looking for me also because you could be convicted of child pornography offenses because you transmitted that video to me. That was chilling for me as a young prosecutor, but it was the first example of how really not sophisticated technology whatsoever. It was really a combination of chatting online in real time plus a video of a female allowed for this type of exploitation, not just this victim in New York, but many, many others, as well as the investigation continued. Fast forward, I took a lot of other jobs at DOJ, including running their digital asset and cryptocurrency enforcement team, advising on cybersecurity issues, and the last job I had was at the National Security Division, where we dealt with all the nation-state harms of all sorts, China, Russia, Iran, et cetera. And in that context, there's 2 that I wanted to highlight, one of which I'm still working on today, unfortunately. First of which was just generally election interference, which was a significant problem that we were seeing both within the United States, but also in various other democracies around the world. At the time that I was in the seat, the technology wasn't good enough for a lot of people to be fooled, but there were certainly many attempts, including voice attempts, to manipulate certain elections, and that could be both domestic or international threats, where they're trying to undermine the bedrock principles of our society. And then the other one was DPRK, remote IT workers. I don't know how many of you are following that, but that is a situation in which to evade sanctions, restrictions on North Korean revenue generation in support of their weapons of mass destruction program. DPRK IT workers will go elsewhere outside of North Korea and pretend to be Silicon Valley dudes named Ari, or located either in the US or Brazil or wherever, and they will get jobs on these sort of gig websites to do part-time work or full-time work for a period for major companies. I think every Fortune 300 company has encountered this threat one way or the other. It's getting much harder to stop onboarding these people as the technologies grow in their convincingness. is that a word? And their accuracy and and it's difficult to determine whether or not things are authentic. So, that's my snapshot. Again, not as perhaps jarring as Mounir's,
Pretty
but
gloomy,
pretty
though.
pretty gloomy, doomy. Yes, I'll take second place on that panel. So I think maybe if we could zoom out a little bit and talk about ways to give you a snapshot of how the threat landscape is presently in a quantifiable way. I know that there were survey results earlier, which we'll talk about sort of our perspectives on in a moment, but there have been some reports of sort of what the threat landscape looks like from various surveys. I think what's shocking here is that, there are some, for instance, from Resemble AI, which recorded 150 deepfake incidents from public sourcing in all of 2024, and they just released their full 2025 year report based on news stories, and they recorded 1,567 unique verified deepfake incidents with nearly 1.3 billion in confirmed fraud losses, which is a significant underestimate because about 80% of these incidents didn't disclose any damage figure whatsoever. There have been incidents where C-suite folks have been victims of impersonation, including pretty sophisticated ones. There was one in Hong Kong that led to a transfer of $25 million because of an impersonation of a CFO on a video call, tricking an employee. CEO fraud targets approximately 400 companies a day, according to some statistics by Keynet Labs. And I think the scariest part is that we only detect about 25% of the time deepfakes as we see them in real time. So that's a number that I think will get worse as the technology gets better. And Europol estimates that about as much as 90% of online content could contain some form of AI-generated material by the end of 2026. So I think that we're really at the precipice of, we're past the inflection point, really at the precipice of uncharted territory here. So these numbers give you some sense of the velocity of the change. The question I have for the panelists here is, in your view, what has materially changed in the last 24 months in how the threat is being used from each of your perspectives, and what do the next 24 months look like? Jump ball.
Yeah, I can start. I think probably it's fairly obvious to all of us that the thing that's changing most radically is just the price. Like the cost for someone to carry out an impersonation attack is just plummeting so quickly that the scale can just increase exponentially. And then, as you said, we're only detecting 1 in 4 of these, and ultimately, and we'll get into this later, I'm sure, but ultimately it's the sort of the ability to solve this problem is really falling on just, am I a human being who can tell that I maybe am being fooled or not? And ultimately, I think that's it's going to be a losing battle. I think next 24 months, I see to me it's just like an exponential curve where this is basically just going to become more proliferated across a wider array of industries. And right now, obviously, it's executives, C-suites, boards, sort of high target individuals who have, who are sort of reputationally known to be, oh, this person has access to a large amount of capital. I think what we're going to see over the next few years is, as these tools proliferate, it will become more and more, grandma, mom, sort of like moving down the chain of more and more people will become potential targets for the level of sophistication that right now is still sort of in financial services and some of these other industries.
Right. They're already being targeted at those various levels. Right. Without the use of deepfake. So it's just going to proliferate. Yeah. You said proliferate. I feel like we've talked about this before. We're going to use the arms race analogy. It's very much, it seems as though while these technologies evolve, there really needs to be the counter to the sort of widespread availability and the sophistication and ease of use of these tools. So we'll see how that goes. Wow, it's all doom.
Optimism.
Yeah.
And this question, unfortunately, can't bring any optimism. I think in the past 24 months, I'd say 3 things have changed materially. One already covered, which is cost. Cost used to be low or zero. As you went down the cost chain, you would get poorer quality results. That's no longer the case. Right? Open source models, things you can run on your phone, let alone a desktop computer with an Apple M3 chip, let alone an M5 chip, which was just released a few weeks ago. So quality is off the charts. And the same, at Adobe we see this cycle over and over again, although not to this degree and not at this velocity, which is the very tools that empower Hollywood to do amazing special effects in After Effects, I'm not here to advertise After Effects, are the same tools that allow people to make others do and say things they never said or did, which can impact the public company CEO on an earnings call. It can impact a politician, but it can also impact you and I and anybody in this room, right? If the incentives are high enough and the barrier to entry is low enough. And I'm telling you, as many people know, that the barrier to entry now is 0 or negative. It's like it's already on your machine. In some cases, that's like a negative barrier to impact. The tool's already there. And reputable companies are making these tools. I would say the other thing to consider is that I think we've seen over the last 12 months that detection doesn't really work. And this may be somewhat controversial, although not on this panel. I think we're all of like mind. Detecting AI-generated material, whether it's video, images, or audio, is just a losing battle. I used to say the good guys are going to lose this arms race, which is like, the good guys have to publish their papers at CVPR and talk about their data sets and open source their data sets. The bad guys who are trying to take advantage of our trust don't have to do any of those things. But they're also just able to move much faster because of the power and decreasing cost of CPUs and GPUs and Amazon and Microsoft infrastructure and others, not to mention what you can run on your home computer. So I think we're finally seeing that the good guys have lost that arms race. I used to say we are going to lose it, but in the past 12 months, I think it's clear. And there are companies who are still at work on forensics, and that needs to continue to happen. Don't let me leave you with the wrong impression. But it doesn't scale at the scale of the ability to create deep fakes and things that co-opt our trust and attention. And therefore, you need other techniques, which we'll talk about more. But those three things together put us in a pretty perilous position right now.
If I can add on, in addition to cost, hyperrealism, quality, velocity intake, we are not slowing down the actual information we're taking in. We are making decisions faster than ever before on systems that are even moving faster than they did 2 years ago. So that creates a hyper potency for anything that might be deceptive if we're one click away. I'm sure all of you on Amazon, I one click and it's literally at your doorstep. Second, profit motive for most public companies. Move faster, take human out of the loop, move towards agentic technologies. Again, speeding up commerce without human review makes us all more vulnerable. So in the last 24 months, I would add that into everything Andy and Ari just mentioned.
Yeah, it's interesting because oftentimes I think traditionally people thought about some of the cybersecurity vectors of insecurity being like human error being very high amongst them. But it's almost, you need a human to be thinking about these from a macro perspective. But also in the arms race, you could see a situation in which human error is compounded simply because the technology is better for you to make that one-click error. So yeah, okay, this is continuing on, and this is like cloudy times. So we had an audience question I thought was actually one that would be, that was submitted ahead of time that was pretty relevant. There is sometimes a tendency to treat deepfakes as primarily a reputational or political problem. Are there threat categories that you think are underappreciated by policymakers and the general public or business or society writ large?
But yeah, I can kick us off on that. So yes, I would caveat by saying I think all these areas are being discussed in the general public, but for the most part, synthetic media, deepfakes, deceptive video is oftentimes connected to major societal and geopolitical, the fake Biden, the fake Trump, the North Korea missile. Those are all very, very concerning and problematic issues. I tend to think more of the mundane tasks that happen every day through digital systems. The insurance claim, the grandmother buying something, the robocall, or the less resilient person that is being deepfaked. Again, not the head of state that has a press corps that follows him around, but the local election ballot person. So I think there are areas that are maybe less sexy in terms of a headline that are more vulnerable and less discussed. And that's where I think synthetic media and deceptive video is really going to have a bigger impact because there's less resilience. Your average insurance adjuster is not thinking through that picture of the Honda Civics coming in as fake, and your average, grandmother or even regular person might not be thinking that on their online dating platform or car buying experience. So I'll start there.
Yeah, I agree fully with Mounir. I think any area of public trust that doesn't enjoy the benefits of your favorite news publication or TV producer that has fact checkers and can do telemetry and digital forensics, has the time and frankly the money to pay people to do those things. And by the way, there are only a handful, maybe dozens of experts in the world who can do the kinds of forensics that we enjoy in our publications of choice, regardless of your politics. So mundane, yes, and I think there's an echelon of fraud in between, which is any industry, public company, private company, startup that doesn't enjoy the benefits of that kind of fact checking and has pressure from their boards or the public investor to make those fast decisions based on media intelligence is really at risk because those decisions can be made and you don't know the consequences of those decisions until much, much later. And then it may be too late. Somebody may have transacted that 25 million transfer to the CEO who wasn't the CEO. And then I think the democratization of video conferencing, which was really sort of cemented by our time working our way through COVID, is a huge problem, right? Are you talking to your financial advisor? Is the email that your financial advisor purported to send you? So this sort of wanes into more traditional cybersecurity territory, but we know how to deal with spam. It took a decade to learn how to deal with spam and have commercial and free products that helped us do that. This really does sound like a doomer panel. I don't mean it to be that, but we don't have that decade.
Lessons learned.
We don't have that decade, but I am optimistic about, and we'll talk more about this, about measures being available to companies and public company officials and politicians and you and me. And I think we just need to wake up and start taking advantage of those tools.
Sure. You want?
Previous speaker, Pfizer said, or other speakers said, we need a system that does not exist. How do we find that system?
I'll tell you all about it. And yeah, we may need more systems that don't yet exist, but I think folks on this panel are bringing them into existence. And I think we have a chance to talk about pragmatic things that are available that I just referenced.
Sure. I mean, I think we previewed that we sort of feel as though detection can't be the only long-term strategy here. So I guess the question is, do you guys perceive of there being specific gaps between current deepfake detection capabilities and what's actually needed to apply to a variety of, applications across industry, banking, customer support, et cetera? That was also a question from the audience. Or is that we can't rely on detection, so we should shift and pivot towards things like provenance and authentication and other primary technical countermeasures?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all agree it's going to be a stack of solutions. I don't think there's a specific like one size fits all. Where we sit in that stack specifically is rather than going the route of detection or rather than going the route of, is this or is this real or is this not real? Our thesis is basically that, especially in, as Andy mentioned, like some of the critical decision processes that are a lot of times happening on video now, is that really we need to be proactive about taking trust that exists in the real world between teams, between individuals, between groups, creating cryptographic connections between those trusted individuals, and then being able to re-verify, hey, am I actually talking to Andy on the other end of this call after I've previously established trust with him? So I think that's not, obviously, that's a scaling problem that will take us a long time to build out that sort of network of trust. But specifically, the way that we think about it in the near to medium term is, how do we form sort of these small, scale down for trust, interconnect for power? Like, how do we form these small pockets where Andy and I are in person now, we can establish a trusted connection, and then no matter where we are, I know that I'm actually I can verify, am I actually speaking to Andy or am I not? And so I think that's becomes a part of the stack in addition to, the TRUEPIC watermark, et cetera, that hopefully over the next 5 years can build out some vaccine resistance, so to speak, to this situation.
Yeah, sort of like offense plus defense, as
Yeah,
it were.
yeah.
Combination.
Yeah, just to respond directly to the gentleman in the audience, I think the solutions exist. I agree. It's a breadth of solutions, and defense in depth, which is a common security term, is needed here. But I also want to focus on very simple solutions that we probably should have had for decades because the technology already existed. For example, if you want to know that something from the New York Times or the BBC or Fox News came from that source and you see it on their website, you can be reasonably confident that it came from your trusted news source. But as soon as those things go on social media, you lose that connection to the source. Why not cryptographically sign, just like you would sign a document or a PDF using DocuSign or hopefully Adobe Sign? Why not sign those materials? I had the opportunity to ask Elon Musk when he took over X at a convening in the UK because my CEO didn't attend the event, but I attended it instead. And on YouTube, you can see his answer to me asking him, wouldn't it be a good idea to cryptographically secure content so we know what it is? And in some cases where privacy is not at stake, who produced it? Again, I was thinking about news sources and governments. And he gave a comically short answer. He said, it seems like a good idea. We should probably do that. Now, that was 3 years ago. I haven't done it. But I'm not here to impugn Elon Musk or Twitter or any other platform. But the technology to do what I'm describing exists. If you want to know that something that purports to come from the BBC or Fox News or the New York Times actually came from that source or the US government, you can know that. We really need platforms to adopt technology that exists, and it's easy for those publishers and sources of information to be trusted in this way. So that exists, it has existed, it's nothing new. In fact, in the C2PA standard that Mounir and I work on together, we endeavored to not create any novel technology that wasn't absolutely necessary to make this possible, because these things like cryptographic provenance and certainty have been proven for decades, and they work pretty well. Nothing's perfect, but they work pretty well in the area of cybersecurity and identity, and we wanted to take advantage of those. So that exists, it can be put to work. It would be awfully nice if platforms and everywhere you see these images, whether it's Syria or Iran or somewhere else, are known to be legitimate. If you choose to look at that information, it should be there.
And so I would just kind of add an up level, if I may, just all three of us. What I think we're seeing is this idea of being proactive, adding something at ideally the moment of capture or the moment of meeting that imbues some trust signal that can be seen downstream or later on, versus a retroactive or a reactive tool where you can see anything online and then decipher some telling of it. Now, by the way, the latter is what everyone wants, right? You want to just scour anything online, drop it into a magic box, and have something or someone tell you, yep, real, no fake. We could definitely discuss why we think, or at least why I think, but I suspect they join me, why that is not possible. But this proactive approach through provenance, C2PA, cryptography, even watermarking and fingerprinting can be very, very useful if you combine all three of them into a proactive approach. That is the system that will help mitigate these harms. Nothing is a silver bullet, in my opinion, but this would be incredibly additive.
Yeah, just to add quickly to that, I mean, Mounir, you mentioned a second ago sort of the speed factor and how, we just want to move faster and faster and faster. I think a part of this also is the very strategic introduction of small points of additional friction. It's like the value proposition of like slightly more friction at a very specific moment can do a tremendous amount of proportional protection than sort of whatever the additional value you'd get for moving 5% faster and not doing that additional piece of friction would. So I think that's a part of the solutioning as well, is like identifying these like specific hinge point moments where a little bit more friction can be maximally valuable.
All right, we're going to turn to a sort of a big picture question here. I think one that I feel as though echoes of debates that I had 30 years ago in college. But content provenance and disclosure standards require broad adoption in order to work. But bad actors will not voluntarily watermark harmful content because they're bad actors. They're trying to evade that. So what combination do you think of market incentives, contractual obligations, and regulatory requirements would actually move the needle on adoption for these types of solutions at scale?
Do you want to start? I'm happy to take this. Can I be somewhat annoying and give a fourth option? What I personally think more so than those three options is consumer awareness. If people who use the systems actually understand that they can have cryptographic evidence of something that was captured and see the transparency, that would be the magic bullet that I would want to see happen. Now, how do we actually drive that awareness? Policy is very helpful there. The reality is I don't see a federal policy moving in anytime soon that really would capture this. We are seeing a lot of bipartisan support, by the way, on this very non-controversial issue of you should have the ability to see the transparency and the origins of digital content. So we are seeing state act. Texas, California, Virginia, New York are all moving towards this, and that helps drive consumer awareness. But I think more could really be done.
Yeah, I'll comment on the regulation front because I don't think it's the solution, but I do think that it's part of a broad solution, and that's because I think I mentioned in my introduction, like we need a catalyst for adoption. I used to joke, although it's not that funny, but I'll try it on you guys, that there's no money to be made in saving democracy.
Doom and gloom.
Yeah. And that's a sort of glib way of saying that you need financial incentives in this country and many other democratic nations. You need capitalistic incentives to get people to do the right thing. And as Mounir knows, and his company's founded on this idea that there are capitalistic incentives to prevent fraud, but also proactively imbue trust in the business operations that you undertake. Now I think we are on the precipice of something really bad, but also on the precipice of a set of tools that can be put to work. C2PA and the standard is just one of them. Ari's company is doing something proximate, like near and critically important for trust as well, and there are many others. And that catalyst could be regulation if it's done correctly. What I worry about is a hodgepodge of state laws in this country and international laws in many countries, India, Korea. There are many laws on the books. Some impactful ones, California and the EU AI Act are set to take effect on August 2nd of this year. That's just a moment away. If we end up with a patchwork of subtly incompatible laws, it's going to be very difficult for consumers, let alone the companies providing the content, to adhere to all of them. And my fear is that we'll end up with least common denominator that really doesn't impact anybody in a maximally positive way. I'm not sure that's a call for federal preemption in this country. I'm not sure, frankly, the federal government has the ability right now in the partisan period we're living in to make those correct laws. But I do have a concern that various states in this country will do what we tried to do in our GDPR moment with the CCPA, which did result in subtly incompatible data privacy laws. And there's something to be said, subtly or spectacularly incompatible. There's something to be said for the GDPR approach, although it was very controversial at the time. It did have the intended effect, I would argue, and it was at the national, international level. So
right. It brought to bear certain principles that everyone had to pay attention to.
Principles, it took years. It spawned
right.
tons of businesses that were highly profitable because GDPR is hard to implement. I think in some respects, content provenance is easier to implement. It's a simpler idea, but it can benefit from regulation as a catalyst.
Well, I mean, you had given media as maybe the biggest sort of example as a platform or an industry that would benefit from that. So you would, I mean, not to put you on the spot, but you would advocate for the implementation of, authentication tools on the part of media companies in particular?
Media companies want to do this. I don't think that's where the problem lies.
Okay, so where are we? Where are you talking about?
I'm an engineer. So
no, it's fine. But you are an expert about these things generally. So I mean, I'm just sort of curious if there are specific areas or industries that you think are ripe for this type of regulation. Not to put you on the spot because it wasn't in our
If you want me to take the spot, I can take it.
Well, I'll say one thing and then I'll pass it over to Mounir, who is a policy person. I think the key, and you mentioned it earlier, is not to pass laws that specifically exist to provide AI transparency, right? There's more to this. In fact, if I think you turned on a piece of regulation and required all our social media platforms to adhere to it today, and they said what many pieces of pending regulation say, which is indicate to a consumer clearly whether something is fully AI generated or partially AI generated. And therein lies the problem. How much generated stuff is too much, right? Is 10 pixels too much? Not if I fixed a leaf or like fixed a stray hair. Well, I don't have a stray hair to fix, but if I did, that's not a problem. But if those 10 pixels, comprise a change that turns a soda can into a gun in a politician's hand, yeah, those 10 pixels really matter. That's too much AI. So there are no good, crisp answers. I don't have them, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, most regulators don't have them. At least I haven't seen evidence of it. And therefore, we should turn some regulation to proving what's real. And I know real and truth and trust and all these terms we're throwing around today are all fraught in their way. But requirement to indicate authentic trust signals on platforms in that last mile between publishers, consumers, creators, and consumers, that's where regulation can really shine. In the meantime, without that, because I don't see it realistically being a thing, the catalyst I would advocate is, if there's a trust signal and you're a platform, show it.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And there's two ways. There's the beginning and the end. There's the creation system. So the California AI Transparency Act just passed this past summer, and it goes into effect, I believe, in 2028. That mandates that camera capture devices sold in the state of California by 2028 have the option, it's not a default, of adding provenance to it. That means you'll have panorama mode, video mode, and ideally a secure mode. When you want to actually show transparency, you have that option. So that's the genesis of a digital image. But the last mile, I actually think, is even more important. It's that when you upload that to some sort of social media platform or car selling or buying platform or online dating platform, now it's just going to be stripped and thrown away. There should be some sort of onus. Hey, if somebody wants to be transparent on your platform, let them be transparent and show the content credentials of that information. And I think that is where the onus should be.
I'm trying to think if the DMCA would cover that. But yeah, I think the question is whether, it's so easy to embed this type of information into metadata, right? That the technology exists. It's just a matter of everyone buying into the notion that we should preserve that authentication. So it's an interesting question. Ari, did you have something to add?
I'm obviously not a policy expert like my friends here. I gravitate towards market solutions, I think, more than anything else. I think, perhaps naively, it feels to me like where at least part of this goes is I'm going to choose to be on a platform or get my information from a platform that is known to be like the place where cryptographic truth exists.
Big T truth.
Yeah, right. So I think if I think about that societally, I think that kind of bifurcates people who, sort of gravitate towards something like that and people who don't. And I think obviously there needs to be regulation in some capacity around this, but I'm less confident, I guess, that sort of any sort of especially federal regulation can get us there.
And just plus oneing that, I really do think that's where the consumer awareness comes. Because I do believe market forces will take over, because you know what? You're going to want to go to the home sharing site that actually has authentic pictures of that home.
Exactly.
I don't trust the images I see on Airbnb. I'm like, I don't think it's going to look like that.
Right.
If there was one that actually had authentic pictures, I would probably gravitate towards that. And I think there would be millions others just like me.
Yeah, or I think a dating app is even like probably from a consumer standpoint, the best version of that.
Interesting. I'm very drawn to Andy's media example in particular. I'm just to insert more doom and gloom. One of the last things I worked on when I was in government was an examination of a Russian election interference effort, in which there are documents that we had that were internal to the Kremlin discussing exactly what they were going to do to try to influence the election. What was interesting is they did precisely what you had highlighted, which is they took trusted news sources from a variety of different perspectives in the US. And when you're on certain social media sites, it looks as though, from what you can tell of the URL, you're going to that particular domain, which is like the number one way that everyone gets tricked is spoofed or near spoofed domains. They'd go and it looked like authentic media, saying all sorts of things that were factually big T truth, like not truthful. And so I think if there was just a standard of people being responsible consumers of media, be it, the catalyst could be that people just start learning about that because the news gets out, information gets out, and people become more aware. It could be catalysts. It could be catalyzed from the platforms themselves or from some sort of government action. But I think it's really important to try to be able to do more than just looking at the URL and being confused as to what the source of the media is. If there's a better way to do it, I think it would really help solve a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I'll just mention there is such a solution. It's the thing that we're working on. There are others, but it's not. I'm going to keep trying to provide a level of optimism to counter your
My death and doom.
Take a look at what Google is doing. If you look at Google's recent announcement, the Pixel 10 phone has content credentials built into it. This is the technology Mounir and I have been talking about. You'll see a little indicator that something is a photo or a photo that was lightly modified with Gemini or something of that nature. If you upload a video soon from that device to YouTube, you'll see these provenance signals. So that's a closed ecosystem because it's Google only, but the standard that's all based on, 100%, is open, free, powered by open source. Like, it couldn't be more free. It's as free as the tools you can use to make a deepfake of a politician. And that's important, and it exists. And that's, when we get to conclusions, I'll reemphasize this point. Like, that technology exists now. If you own a Pixel 10 phone, it's there. It's not on your iPhone yet, unfortunately. But I am optimistic that it will be because consumers will require it. If you can have that for free and turn it on, whether it's secure mode or it's just on by default, why wouldn't you want that? I haven't heard a cogent argument that that's not something people want. If it's inexpensive enough to implement, ubiquitous enough for consumers, this is how we'll turn the tides.
It was that, I guess I was going to, Ari, did you have something to say? Oh, question.
A quick question on that. You brought up your pictures on Airbnb. You brought up the program signals in there. As we see more AI agents, right? Higher adoption of that. Do you think these things are you seeing any evidence if those things are becoming more important for the companies that are adopting these AI agents to do things?
Yes, but I think, with all due respect, like, evidence is also, like, we can use our common sense without evidence. If you have agents acting on behalf of agents, everything is agents all the way down, right, and they can access the same tools we do, whether it's Photoshop, which is perfectly capable of making something that didn't happen appear to happen, or video tools. You're delegating responsibility down a large stack of agents, which is starting to happen. I mean, the OpenClaw moment is that moment. Then you need provenance more than ever, right? Now, how you interpret a sea of signals coming back up from the lowest claw all the way up to, your chat GPT of choice, that's a hard problem. That's a user interface option. But I worry about the problems that we're not seeing, like with claws and autonomous agents. Like, this stuff, I suspect, is already happening, and we will see evidence. It's inevitable.
Yeah, I would just add to that, in that we work a lot with insurance companies and with banks or credentialing firms. When you fully go into agentic systems and you truly don't have humans in the loop at some point, where's your grounding to reality? Like, especially if you're using digital visual documentation for something, an inspection or something, there has to be some grounding to reality at some point. And we know the agentic systems are going to be pushed because they move faster and they're going to be more cost efficient. You're going to need some provenance signals in between, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think provenance in a layer of trusted humans, to interact with that agentic layer, where it's like, okay, an agent can send an approval up the chain, and you still have the right human who is able to see the chain of custody of whatever that information is or that decision is, make a decision about it, and then let that move forward. Again, it kind of goes back to these places where, okay, there needs to be just a slightly additional bit of friction to prevent the entire system from collapsing.
So I'm going to inject another audience question that we had, which is, there are a lot of different areas of harm that we've discussed so far: fraud, potentially things like defamation, election interference, et cetera. Do you have a sense of whether or not certain existing laws in various areas, you can pick any area you want other than those three as well, if any of those existing laws can be adapted to synthetic media without overreaching? Do you have any hopes for any of that?
Is it cheating for me to point to the California AI Transparency Act that was just passed? that to me strikes me as one of the best pieces of legislation that can be built upon. It can be tweaked. I know industry wasn't incredibly happy about it, but interestingly, major companies in Silicon Valley did not unleash all their lobbyists to shoot it down, because I think there was an understanding, it was an inevitability that provenance signals are going to have to be worked in. So I would build on that, and I do question, I don't know if this answers your question, if we over-rely on legislation to mark AI outputs, we might miss the boat. I really do think it's about the authentic content. So ensuring custody and transparency in authentic content, which I think Article 50 of the EU's AI Act does a pretty good job. It's still vague. We haven't seen the code of practice yet, but I would point to those two.
Yeah, what were the 3 areas you mentioned?
I mentioned fraud, defamation, election interference, but you can pick any area, open field.
Yeah, I'll go back to copyright, which is very much in peril, but perhaps less impactful to all of us in this room. I think in all the areas you mentioned, and copyright especially, we don't really have time to wait for case law and modifications of decades or centuries old laws that have been on the books. So I kind of think they're going to have to be good enough to some degree. Call me like a doomer when it comes to politics and how our government is working or not working right now. But I'm a little bit pessimistic about the ability to change those laws. The amount of time it will take to change existing law will be outpaced by far by the technologies that are invented to end run around them. So I have concerns. Again, I agree with Mounir and what I said earlier. Just to reiterate, is that we need regulation to catalyze implementation of things that actually can have a positive effect, rather than relying fully on rules and good behavior and prosecution of violators to help us in these ways.
I'd also add, agree with both Andy and Mounir, but I think sometimes there's unintended consequences from even potentially well-meaning, like Section 230, I think is a great example of, it created a lot of the conditions that allowed for the disinformation environment to exist, even though in 1996 it was
a good idea.
Right, exactly. And so I think, again, I kind of fall back, for better or for worse, on sort of what are the, as we've discussed, the kind of the proactive solutions that we as technologists can offer the market that eventually just become such a better experience and become the underpinning of commerce and interaction and communication that people just choose.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I'm going to weigh in just because I think I'm the only one who went through law school, whatever tortured way I did back in the day. But what's interesting about the question that was posed is that each of those areas already have existing laws that cover the outcomes of certain actions, and they're agnostic as to how those outcomes come about. And so a lot of the laws that exist now, I agree with the panelists writ large in that I don't think that there is a scenario in which we can rely on legislatures or regulators to be able to understand AI at the pace that it's developing so that they can constantly update the statutes and regulations as they need to be updated if they have that level of specificity. But I think we're seeing more outcome-related legislation at the AI level, for at the state level, where people are concerned about material decisions in highly regulated industries like insurance or the financial sector, how loans are being given, et cetera. And so that is how the needle is being moved in terms of making sure that from those sort of risk-based scenarios, institutions are ensuring that when they adopt agentic, when they're adopting these tools, they are keeping a human in there so that they can have responsibility and they can explain the decision-making process, which they wouldn't be able to do if they simply relied on the technology. So I don't know, maybe I am also an optimist. I'm sort of like the wire fraud statute basically didn't talk about telephones, didn't talk about any of the things I used it to charge over time, but it's because it's a flexible statute. Same with the 1030 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act statute. That didn't change for most of the period of time that people have been alive in this room, but it's still a pretty flexible tool. So I think as long as people are thinking about it in the macro sense and in terms of the outcomes and less about how exactly you get there, I think we're probably in safer spaces.
Yeah, the only point I would, just to piggyback
Oh, cool.
No, at the end of the day, just quickly, discriminatory impact is discriminatory impact.
Right, exactly.
Whether the human is perpetuating it or an agent is, but ultimately the question is accountability. That's right.
Right.
It's not going to be the agent, it's not going to be the technology. So I think that's the mindset.
Yeah, I think like one example of that, if we want to get back to the law for a second, is that, there were discriminatory action, sort of issues that came up in Fannie Mae in the way that they did lending that predated AI, but certainly was talking about machine learning and sort of the capacity to take away human decision-making in that context and automate things that humans would do otherwise. And so I think that's what it is. It's discriminatory impact is impact. And as long as that law is good law, then it doesn't matter exactly how you get there. You got to be responsible for the outcome. So I think that's a good point. Okay, looking ahead. Let's be more optimistic, maybe. Under what conditions does a synthetic media threat become more manageable in your view? And under what conditions does it become significantly worse? What are the leading indicators from your perspective as to what to watch in this area?
I mean, I think the three of us are all working on solutions at different places in the stack that I'm quite optimistic about. I think it comes down to, can we create the right incentive structure for companies and consumers to want to be proactive? Is it profitable? Will it save me time? Will it save me money? If I introduce a little bit more friction or if I sort of adopt some new behavior, is it in my cost benefit analysis, is it going to benefit me in some way to do that? So I think that's our job, to figure out what are the best ways that we can deliver that value for people long term. I think if we fail at giving a good user experience and convincing people that this is important, I think the problem gets infinitely worse. And I see it ultimately as this is a civilizational problem. If trust breaks down, what do we have? If I can't trust what I'm seeing, if my boss is emailing me, or if my wife is sending me a text message, or if my banker is calling, what are we even doing? We're just gonna have to get back to sending letters in the mail or whatever.
That's better. I think that's going to be a better option.
I mean, it might be at this point, but certainly that would be more friction. But
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of these problems aren't new, right? Misinformation, disinformation has been around for centuries or millennia. So, one way this fails, to the opposite of just to be a contrarian, is if we try to solve all the problems all at once, we're going to fail, and we're going to end up in Ari's dystopian, fictional universe. I think where we succeed is if we can push trust signals, trust decisions past platform boundaries, and it could be business platforms or social media platforms or news purveyors, whenever possible, push the trust decisions all the way to consumers. Those could be trust decisions about purchases, about Airbnb, about what news I believe, about who's giving me the news and whether I trust that person or that institution. Where we fail, it's not just purchase decisions in business and text from your wife. It's the ability to have an open discourse about reality. If we lose that, if there's no shared objective truth, and I do think that we're kind of on the verge, if you zoom out of that, right? Because if you trust social media, you trust images, you trust visual media, which always evokes a more sudden, quick, emotional response. Video in particular has been proven over and over again, than reading an article, which takes too much time. And our kids and their kids are going to have shorter and shorter attention spans. I mean, this is a truism. There's a gentleman who runs a company in the UK called Synthesia, who's gotten on the TED stage and said, this generation, like his kids and my child, will be the last generation that needs to read, that will learn to read. Now, that's controversial, but if you think about it, it's certainly within the realm of possibility. It's possible that within a few generations, information intake and output and conversation will be so visceral and so quick, and our attention spans will be so small because agents are doing all the thoughtful work, that we'll be in trouble. And the trouble ends with not being able to have a face-to-face conversation with any of you where we have some objective shared sense of reality. And that's what's on the line.
So,
and we're at time, so make it quick. I've been We're getting there.
The leading indicators I would look for, consumer demand and awareness. That is going to drive the products, the phones we buy. That is going to drive the constituents to elect the leaders that put in the laws. And the conversation has to move from AI to authenticity. Those are the indicators I look for.
Thank you so much, and hopefully we can all thank the panelists for their time today.
Thank you.